Thank you for attending this this talk. My name is Glenn Harper. I manage the Range and Wildlife Division in Santa Ana, and I've been with the Pueblo since 1999. Yeah, gosh. Lawrence Beta had asked me to do a presentation to fill one of the slots, and so I thought I would talk about the predation patterns and utilization distributions of mountain lions and black bears that we've been looking at on the Pueblo. And I really should say, you know, on the Pueblo and outside of the Pueblos, because after this talk, you'll see that they're just not staying on the Pueblo. So with that, I'll go ahead and start. And I guess, Caitlin, if anyone has any questions throughout it, you're just going to prompt me and verbally or through audio or on the screen.
Yes, I can prompt you verbally. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat at the bottom of the page, and we'll make sure that Glenn has a moment to answer those.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start just with a little bit about the Pueblo of San Diego, so that everybody's familiar with the Pueblo. The Tamayame, or the people of the Pueblo of Santa Ana, there's about, as of this morning, there's 877 enrolled members, and they live in 3 communities along the Rio Grande, and there's also the traditional village of Tamaya. They have about, when the Spanish came and the grants went through, there were about 17,000 acres in this area, and through the years, the Pueblo has been able to reacquire its ancestral lands, and the red polygon is about 79,000 acres. And then as recently as 2016, the Pueblo purchased the Mayacuiquinipu, which is part of their ancestral domain, and that's about 59,000 acres. So collectively, they've gone from about 17,000 acres to 139,000 acres through the years. The area we're going to talk mostly about today is this area over here, because we're still learning a lot about the new property. We have a lot more information on things that are happening on this section. Can you all see my cursor moving? I hope so, because I'm using it as a pointer.
Yes, we can see it, Glenn.
Excellent. Oh, something happened to my keyboard. Okay. So the Rio Jemez flows through the Pueblo of San Diego. The Rio Grande is a confluence and the Jemez flows into the Rio Grande. The confluence is here. There is about a 1,300-foot elevational gradient between the lowlands down here on the Rio Grande and the higher elevations up on top of Santa Ana Mesa. The landscapes consists of mostly woodlands, grasslands, and shrubland environments. The Rio Grande, for instance, has a historical floodplain of Bosque cottonwood. This is an area that doesn't overbank anymore, so these cottonwoods are 50 to 70 years old. There's also the active floodplain, which is the area that the Pueblo's been working in a lot to try to regenerate a lot of the riparian vegetation in the area. And that's 6 miles of this reach. And then there's the agricultural fields all the way over here on the right, which make up about 1,200 acres of the Pueblo's land base. Along the Rio Jemez, it's kind of similar. There's 12 miles of the Rio Jemez. This is an overbank or an area that will flood if the conditions are right. We haven't seen those conditions, unfortunately, for years, but it has a potential to overbank, and there's a lot of young stands of willow and cottonwood. And collectively, these riparian areas total about 4,800 acres. We also have about 28,000 acres of Chihuahuan Desert, shortgrass prairie grasslands, and about 6,200 acres of Great Basin and Chihuahuan Desert shrublands. And by far the most dominant vegetation type along the landscape is a juniper savanna or juniper woodlands, about 35,000 acres of juniper savanna. So these are the vegetation types that basically occur on the Pueblo and support the Pueblo's wildlife populations. And then when we look at the interannual precipitation in the area, the 0 line on this graph is the long-term average, which is about 8.86 inches of rain, and that's from 1924 to 1982. And so what this graph shows you is years, 21 years of data that we've collected from 24 rain gauges, and it shows the departure from that average of 8.86. So anything below this is below average, anything above this is above average. And this is important. I'll get to that in just a second, but we've only had 2 wet years, and we consider a wet year or a dry year anything that's out is 25% outside of the average. So if it extends higher than this or falls below this, this is a drought year, this is a wet year. During that time, we've seen mostly dry years, 8 dry years to be exact. Even though the math on 2013 shows that we were 11% above average, biologically, this didn't come, all this rain came like in the middle of September, and this is based on the water year, so it's October 1 through the end of September. So biologically, this is a drought year. We just got a massive push of moisture that came through, and I consider that a drought year. But we're basically working between average precipitation compared to the long-term average and drought, which is, as you all know, it's pretty tough to work around, especially when you get a drought like the 2000s drought that killed a lot of pinyon trees in the central New Mexico, and then the most recent drought. These are big droughts that have big impacts on the quality of vegetation on the landscape. When you're trying to manage for these kind of large charismatic species that are important to the tribe, you have to you have to work with what you get. And with precip being average to dry, the Pueblo has implemented numerous habitat enhancement projects. We've worked with our livestock owners to graze more sustainably, put out water features on the landscape, and the idea is that we're trying to build a resilient watershed that can withstand these droughts that come through. And for some species, such as pronghorn and turkey, these are species that were extirpated from the Pueblo, and the Pueblo has brought them back through translocation projects over the years. So we can do all the work on the ground and try to improve habitat for wildlife. But one of the biggest things that occurred on the Pueblo in October 2005 was this policy change where the tribe enacted a wildlife conservation code after years and years of basically unregulated hunting for this is the first wildlife code, so it was always unregulated. And to give you an idea of what unregulated looked like, this is when we first started flying our aerial surveys. So this is the minimum number of detections on elk and mule deer over the years. And to give you an idea what the code did, this is when the code went into place. And so we started seeing this increase in numbers. And these aren't giant numbers. We're still we have small populations, but we're building them. And then somewhere around 2009, things kind of plateaued. We missed a couple of survey years during this period, but around 2009, maybe 2010, everything plateaued. And we were wondering why. The tribe had closed hunting through 2011, and there were minimal tags dispersed that shouldn't have really an effect on the population. So one of the things we noticed is that after 4 or 5 years of our camera trap monitoring, oops, I forgot about this. Our pronghorn population was also kind of stagnant, and we were seeing adult mortality due to predation. And so after 4 or 5 years of camera trap monitoring, we picked up our first bear. So in 2009 was the first time that we'd actually captured a bear on camera. And just a few months later, we had our first lion show up. And so the question is, are these predators coming into, we're putting a lot of protein on the ground when we're translocating pronghorn and we're building populations. So that's obviously desirable to predators. And the question is, does the tribe decide to go out and eradicate all predators, which is kind of a no-brainer if you want to build populations? But because bears and mountain lions are ecologically, but also traditionally important, that's not really an option that the tribe wanted to take. And so what we ended up doing is putting together a grant proposal submitted to the Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. And the idea is that the Tribal Council is in support of capturing bears and lions with the idea that we could look at their predation patterns, and perhaps if there is a particular lion or bear that's predating heavily on species of concern to the Tribal Council, that could be a lion that could be harvested. And so the idea was to not cull the whole population, but to cull based on the efficiency of an individual lion taking ungulates. And then we also wanted to look at home ranges. I mean, we see bears down here, we see lions on camera, but we know they're not here all the time. We suspect that anyway. And we also wanted to look at corridors, because the tribe has been working to try to rebuild connectivity to its land. And we figured that by looking at the mountain lion movement and bear movements, that would give us some insight as to where these species that require large home ranges, where they're crossing, and that'll give us the information to work in the future. So we started collaring bears, and we use box traps or walk-in traps, and we use snares. This is Scabby Butt. He's a adult male. We call him Scabby Butt because every time he showed up on our wildlife camera, he had cockleburrs plastered to his rear end from being, I guess, sitting in the bosque along the river. But he was a tough bear. We actually collared him twice, and it's kind of hard to tell from this, but his neck circumference is bigger than his head. And so we had to put this collar on tight enough so that it didn't hurt him, but also loose enough so that, or tight enough so it wouldn't fall off, but loose enough so that it would allow him to survive. And unfortunately, this guy would pull off his collar every time we caught him, so we stopped collaring it. And then we ended up catching another adult male that was actually previously collared by New Mexico State University on a project up in the Jemez Mountains. We collared him, and he was collared for about 8 months, and then unfortunately he died of natural causes. He was an old male. He died on a neighboring Pueblo, and so we don't have any information on him anymore. But he did give us some value of information on locations. And then we collared Tyra. Tyra's an adult female that was actually living in the Sandhill Mountains, but got in trouble, and Game Department, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, captured her, ear collared her, or ear tagged her, and set her free in the Jemez, and then now she's basically spending time on the Pueblo of San Diego. And she was collared for 26 months, and her collar finally ran out of batteries, so we don't know where she's at today, but we'll hopefully pick her up on camera. And so all of these bears, we went out and we looked at what they were eating, and we found that they were scavenging on livestock kills or livestock mortalities. They weren't the cause. They were just scavenging on some old bones. Same thing with deer. We didn't detect any of these bears killing deer, but what we did find is that they are pretty effective at annihilating ant colonies. I don't know if you can see the ants in there, but this is basically Tyra that was feeding on ants. And then sedges and grasses, they're pretty good at mowing those down. And then also they've massacred juniper berries, and then they will feed on tad cactus fruits quite a bit. And apparently tad cactus fruit has quite a laxative effect, because this is kind of interesting. I thought for sure that this bear had killed an ungulate of some sort because it spent so much time here. And this was his bed, or her bed. This is Tyra's bed, and she barely made it out of bed. And you can see how much cactus fruit she was eating. And so this is only based on 2 bears, and we know bears in other parts of the country will kill ungulates, and particularly fawns or calves, but we didn't detect that. Mountain lions, we first caught our first mountain lion in March of 2017. His collar was on. We named him Big Tom, and that's for obvious reasons. He's a huge lion, and we named him Big Tom, and we had him collared for 5 months, and then his collar released prematurely. Now, we haven't seen him on camera yet, and we're not sure what his fate was. But during that time, he gave us some interesting data that we'll go over later. And then in 2017, we captured Broken Leg. He was an adult male, and we had him collared for about 2 years. And then he was killed on Highway 550 by a vehicle back in June of 2020. And then we ended up catching just in February of 2018, we captured Notch. She was our first adult female. We called her Notch because you can kind of see a little notch in her ear here. She was pretty easy to identify even before we caught her. She was collared for about 11 months, and unfortunately her collar failed. They're pretty hard on these collars, but her collar failed, and I think we saw her about 6 months ago on camera, but we don't know where she's at today. But before we caught her in February of 2018, she was showing up on camera. So this is September of 2017. She was showing up on camera with her 3 nearly adult kittens. This is Notch over here, and these are her kittens. And basically, we ended up catching in April of 2018. We caught one of her female kittens. So this is a sub-adult. And this is, we named her Little Girl because she was pretty small. We had her collared for 16 months, and then her collar released as it was expected. And then shortly after we caught Little Girl, we caught we named him Lefty. He was a sub-adult male, a son of Notch also, just like Little Girl was a daughter of Notch. And we had him collared for 14 months. He dispersed, and then he ended up running into some poison on neighboring lands, and unfortunately, he died from that. And then going back to Notch, you can see she still has her collar on here. In October of 2018, well, she had denned, and between her 3 kittens, she denned again. She had 3 more kittens, and then these were the 2 surviving kittens. And at this point in October 2000, or November of 2019, they're about 13 months old. And this one here is this guy right here. His name is Squeaks. He's a young male. You can kind of still see the spots on him. We caught him in February of 2020. And there's an interesting story behind this guy too. These lines are pretty interesting. And then we ended up in October of 2020 catching Jack. He's a 5+-year-old male, a large male lion that we've had collared since. He's still collared to this day. And then in January of 2021, we ended up catching another sub-adult male. His name's Sammy, and he is collared to this day as well. He's got some interesting patterns in the way he's using the landscape. And then in February, next month after that, in 2021, we caught this sub-adult female. She was about 14, 15 months old, we suspected. And she's still collared. So right now we have 4 collared lions. The other collars are pretty much done. And we've been able to track these guys track their predation patterns on any of the neighboring lands that give us access. You know, access is obviously important if we're going to kind of follow their predation, to verify their predation sites. And for the most part, we've been able to work with the neighbors on that. And what we found is just like you'd expect, you know, they're killing elk, in this case, you know, bull elk. And they're also taking mule deer, as you would expect. And then pronghorn as well. You know, we knew that we were losing pronghorn to lions, but this confirms it. And then some of the things that we really didn't expect is how effective they are at skinning porcupines. And beavers must be incredibly tasty because they seem to really like beavers. And then Sandhill Cranes was something that we didn't expect, but you know, the way the Sandhill Cranes will roost at night on the river's edge are pretty easy target if they're in shallow water, especially for a lion. And then they're taking other predators, smaller predators like coyotes and raccoons and badgers. And then one of the things that we didn't really expect, another thing, was that they actually eat feral horses. This is This is a 2+-year-old feral horse. That's a giant animal for a lion. And I think this one was killed by Big Tom. And it may be part of the reason why he was so big and strong, because he was getting a lot of protein. But they were also killing burros. These are feral burros also. And a Mouflon ram sheep that we had no idea was even on the Pueblo. We suspect it came from a neighboring community because they had taken some pictures of some Mouflon sheep that they thought were bighorns. And we suspect that this is one of those rams. They're killing domestic dogs. These are not necessarily out of someone's backyard. These are feral dogs that are running free on the rangelands. They didn't ever kill anybody's dog, in proximity to a home. And then at first I looked at this when I saw it and I was like, oh, that's another raccoon. But then when you look at it a little bit closer, they're also killing domestic cats, and these are also feral cats. So if you want to get rid of some invasives or feral animals that are on the landscape, lions can contribute to that. And so people have always asked me, how do you know, where they've killed things and what they're killing and where they're killing them and all that. And so this is an example of the data that I'm able to pull up twice a day. So the GPS collars collect a GPS location every 2 minutes. I'm sorry, every 2 hours. And then those locations are transmitted twice a day to me. So when I come in the morning, I'm able to kind of see where that lion was at the night before. And for instance, in this case, the lion came in along that line up here and then made a kill at this location. And you can see that he moved away from the kill. So he bedded down here and went back to the kill, came over here and bedded, went back to the kill, came over here and bedded. So you kind of get this spoked pattern around a cluster of points. And whenever we see that, we go visit the site to see what's been killed. And so what are they killing? Well, Broken Leg, which was the lion that I talked to you about that was collared for 2 years, we have the most complete data set on his predation patterns. And you can see that the bulk of his food was basically coming in between raccoons, maybe up to deer, but lots of badgers and lots of elk and coyotes. Now, when you look at all the lions across, here, something popped up on my screen. Across the lions that we have collared, so we've got 9 lions collared. 2 of them were killing badgers. Not all of them were killing badgers. So beavers, just about everybody was killing beavers. And the whole point of this is that to show that they have varied diets. And I suspect feral horse should be really up here. We weren't able to get access to some of the lands that showed patterns like feral horse, where a lion would stay to kill for close to 14 days. Usually a lion is on a kill for 2 to 3 days for a small predator, maybe a week for a mid-sized ungulate, 10 to 12 days for an elk. But when you see these 14-day patterns, you know that they're eating something big. So we weren't able to get a complete picture of the feral horse information, but I suspect that should really be a lot more. And so, sorry, my computer's locking up again. Is it advancing on yours?
No, it's still on the graph.
Okay.
And we've got 5 more minutes too.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to burn through this. So I want to go back to Squeaks, because he kind of brings in this whole different perspective on this, besides predation patterns and more. This is more about corridor and home range. So Squeaks is that young adult that was going to disperse. And the gold dots on here are from Notch, his mother. And you can kind of see that he hung out with his mom after he was collared. And then starting in about April after he was collared, he started making these moves to try to leave his natal range. You can see that all the way up here, until eventually in July of 2020, he finally left the natal range. So this brings up this whole question about space and connectivity, because where he went is pretty interesting, and I'll go over that more in just a minute. But the tribe is basically using this mountain lion data, this bear data, as a surrogate for other wildlife species, and determining where corridors exist on the landscape. And so if you take bears, for instance, and so this is the the 2 black bears that we were able to keep collars on. It's based on 5,000 locations roughly. This is a heat map that's at a population level, so that's averaging the 2 bears data together. And what it gives you is it's based on a Brownian bridge movement model. And so it's giving you information about where, you know, it's utilization of the landscape. And so bears never, the 2 bears that we had collared never crossed 550, nor did they ever cross I-25. These are 4-lane roadways with a tremendous amount of traffic volume. The 6 mountain lions that we were able to analyze this data on, because we still got the other collars out in the field, you know, they didn't have a problem crossing 550, but they still didn't cross I-25. And so the interesting, and this is a huge range. This is the Rio Puerco over here, if anyone's familiar with that. This is the Valles Caldera up here. The lions that were captured right here are basically moving a large distance across the landscape. And so when you look at Santa Ana, the proper 79,000 acres, in 2008 or 2006, Bird's Eye View did a wildlife corridor, mountain lion corridor analysis across roadways in New Mexico under the Department of Game and Fish contract. And this is all a GIS project. It's not data driven by lion locations, but it's driven by topography, by road density, housing density, vegetation, water, all these other characteristics that you can create a habitat suitability model. And so the red is basically what was considered the most likely path for a mountain lion to move from the Sandia Mountains here to the Jemez Mountains. And if you add, this keeps doing this. If you add our data on that, so this is our mountain lion data, you can kind of see that mountain lions are crossing over here on 550. There's nothing crossing here, but this merges well with the way lions use this part of the landscape. And then when you add our roadkill data in, so the red would be kind of the corridor areas. It matches pretty well with including a lion and a bear that get killed right here and a lion that got killed over here. This basically is telling us that this section of I-25, because this matches our ungulate GPS data information, that they're not crossing I-25. So the Pueblo needs to work on trying to mitigate wildlife crossing in this area and then protect the animals that are crossing in this area. And with that, I know that was kind of quick at the end, but I think I made it just under a minute. I'd like to thank the Pueblo of Santa Ana for their support of this, all our staff at the Department of Natural Resources, the Fish and Wildlife Service for funding under the Tribal Wildlife Grants Program, Department of Game and Fish for working with us on capturing and helping capture lions, and the Pueblos of Laguna, Sandia, Cochiti, Zia, Jemez, and Santo Domingo for allowing us access, and then Mules and Hounds for the dog work, Mesa Verde National Park for, oh, I forgot to speak about that, but Mesa Verde for working with us on checking on Squeaks' kills up there. He is actually, he dispersed all the way to Southwest Colorado. Durango Nature Center too for checking on some kills. Western Ecosystems Technology for their support in the data analysis, and Defenders of Wildlife for providing support for the analysis as well. And with that, thank you. I'm 8 seconds under.
Thank you, Glenn. One very quick question before we move on to our next speaker from the chat. We were asked, how did you train your lions to target feral horses? Please share your secret.
Well, that's an interesting question because it was hard to train them. The hardest part was just holding them. No, really, it seems that there is a matrilineal connection between lions killing horses. So Notch, for instance, we know that she kills horses. We know that her offspring kill and continue to kill horses. And we haven't checked all the kills because, like I said, the access issues. But it's really, I think, driven by, you know, they've learned it from mom, essentially. So if you can find a lion, and that in our perspective, from my perspective, that's a lion that you know, that you want on the landscape if you're trying to control feral horse encroachment. And just to let everybody know, the tribe never implemented any sort of culling on the lions. I think Broken Leg was pretty close because he was really having an impact on the elk population. We didn't fly surveys last year, aerial surveys last year because of COVID, but I suspect when we fly it this year, the elk numbers are going to be coming back up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.